In a dusty chicken yard in Norway sometime around 1906, a curious 10-year-old boy began watching the hens fight. Not just fight, but negotiate, assert, concede. They weren't random flurries of feathers and beaks. There was a rhythm, a sequence, a story. He noticed something peculiar, that hen A would peck hen B, but hen B would never peck hen A back. B, instead, might turn to peck hen C, who herself would submit and go peck hen D. The boy's name was Thorleif Schjelderup-Ebbe, and he would grow up to become a zoologist. But even as a child, he had stumbled onto something that would outlive him. He called it hackordnung, the pecking order, a linear dominance hierarchy among animals. It wasn't just that some hens were meaner than others. It was that each had a place, a rank, a right to rule over the ones below. His observations, published in the early 1920s, were modest, careful. He wrote with the tone of someone unsure if the world would take him seriously, but the world listened. Before long, the idea would escape the coop, first to other animals, pigeons, dogs, primates, then to humans, business, politics, schoolyards, the playgrounds of boys and men. Pecking order became a metaphor, and metaphor became dogma. But the henhouse was only the beginning. In a Swiss zoo, decades later, a man turned his attention to a different animal, one far more noble, far more dangerous. The wolves were watching. High in the mountains above the valleys of Zurich, where the snow silences even the wind, a myth was born. A myth of strength, of solitude, of order. Behind the iron bars of a zoo enclosure, a legend was born. It did not rise with a howl, but with a pin, and the man who held it was Rudolf Schenkel. In 1947, Rudolf Schenkel published his now famous observations of wolves in captivity. In their endless pacing, in their fights over scraps, an order of precedence was forming. He saw domination. He saw a hierarchy founded on the incessant control and repression of the competition, and he crowned the victor Alpha. This idea fit our world all too well, a world obsessed with power, with struggle. The Alpha ruled, the Beta obeyed. It wasn't just biology, it was our destiny, whether we were willing to admit it or not. Decades later, another wolf expert, David Meck, returned to the wild, and there the story fell apart. Wolves don't struggle to the top, they form families. Alphas weren't fighters, but fathers. But by then the myth had metastasized. It lived in self-help books, business seminars, locker room sermons. Alphas, betas, omegas. Wolves repurposed for men chasing meaning. This was no longer the domain of dry biology textbooks. It became the gospel for a new breed of men. Online, the language hardened, taking on a darker tone. Pickup artists peddled ways to exploit insecurities. Self-help gurus crowned themselves alphas. The pack mentality returned, not by nature, but by meme. But something didn't fit. The alpha persona couldn't protect, only conceal. The men who wore it worked for a naked self-interest. Though they did all they could to cloak themselves in nobility and bravado, there was nothing behind the mask. The alpha didn't bring peace. He brought anxiety, isolation, imitation without purpose. A boy sought to claim the crown, only to see it disintegrate in the palm of his hand. Hopeless and alone, the boy began to hate. Over time, that hate would grow, transforming into a horrible resolve, expressed in one word: revenge. And those who betrayed him would pay. Yet that natural order was a fable. There was no crown to claim, no noble knights to dally forth in defense of honor, just a scientific veneer to paste over the tales we like to tell ourselves. The Alpha was not a product of nature, but a metaphor, misread, memed, and monetized. A kingdom built on bad science and good storytelling. And like all castles built in the clouds, it began to collapse. There was always a truth hidden behind the myth. The leader was not feared, he was trusted, and he repaid that trust with care and devotion. We didn't want dominance, we wanted direction. And when the myths cracked, the darkness crawled through the gaps. In case you couldn't tell, this video is about the movie American Psycho. Actually, it's about a YouTube video called Literally Me Characters, Men and Misunderstanding Media by the Book and Movie Guy. Actually, it's not even about that video per se, but about media literacy and how this concept is used to dismiss novel and subversive readings of media. See, according to the Book and Movie Guy, the whole Literally Me phenomenon, guys identifying with Travis Bickle or Patrick Bateman or the Joker, isn't just cringe. It's proof that we've all become media illiterate. We're not supposed to see ourselves in these characters. We're supposed to recognize them as warnings, as monsters, as cautionary tales of what not to become. In TBMG's reading, when men start saying, "That's literally me," they're not just misunderstanding these films, they're falling for the mimic of meaning. It's not just a meme, it's a cry for help that can only be answered by proper media literacy, learning to read the subtext, to learn the true meaning, and to reorient themselves toward enacting systematic change, and realizing that how you feel is valid, how you feel is normal, but it is not okay to hurt others as a result. Though notably, what counts as a good change, and who gets to decide, is left unspoken. Take his discussion of the Barbie movie. For TBMG, Ken's arc is a deliberate deconstruction of the Literally Me character. Ken feels overlooked and emasculated, goes rogue, and for a moment, he looks like another Bickle or Bateman. Angry at the world, seeking validation through power. But unlike the classic Literally Me icons, Ken is given a second chance. He's offered compassion, healing, a way out, delivered by a woman no less. The film's message, TBMG argues, is clear. Don't be literally him. Be better. Don't misread the movie and adopt a toxic identity. Learn the lesson, and you'll be saved. But then there's Shoe on Head. Shoe's review is something else entirely. Instead of policing what Barbie means, she pokes fun at the whole idea of getting the message right. For Shoe, Barbie is a Rorschach test. You can see whatever you want in it. Woke, anti-woke, conservative, Tumblr core, alt-right, whatever. If you look for it, you'll find it. Ken's Mojo Dojo Casa House is either a brilliant satire of patriarchy, or just, a fun place to hang out. The politics are so on the nose that they loop back around to being subversive. And honestly, the best parts of the movie aren't the lectures about gender roles, or the Twitter thread monologues. They're the parts where the film just lets itself be weird, or funny, or beautiful, or messy. Shoe's point is that the meaning of Barbie, and by extension of American Psycho, Fight Club, or any other Literally Me films, isn't delivered from on high by the screenwriter, or by the critics, or by some institution of media literacy. The meaning is what you find in it, what your community memes into it, what makes you laugh, or cry, or say, "Yeah, that's literally me." Here's the thing. Both approaches, TBMG's media literacy policing and Shoe on Head's meme-driven remixing, are doing something real. TBMG presents a textbook example of literary and media analysis, elegantly demonstrating how American Psycho's message is constructed through film. On a theoretical level, his proliferation cycle is especially valuable, as it acknowledges the complex interplay between irony and sincerity, and how the internet uniquely allows these threads to interact and interweave. But only Shoe's perspective actually makes room for new readings, for play, for ambiguity, for real engagement with what it means to live through these stories. TBMG wants to rescue us from misreading. But if you look closer, media literacy here doesn't mean understanding a film's complexity, it means agreeing with the approved interpretation. And if you disagree, you're not just wrong, you're illiterate. You're outside the discourse. Engaging with media through this lens starts to feel less like reading for meaning and more like memorizing a catechism. Every question already answered, every ambiguity already hammered into a hardened orthodoxy, until there's no room left for terror, awe, or doubt. To be clear, I'm not here to play the enlightened centrist. If my criticism of TBMG feels especially rich or ironic, it's because I'm a Christian. I believe in a Bible that has an original intention, and I appreciate the hermeneutical tools that help us approach it. Likewise, I respect the discipline of media analysis, and the way it can foster layered conversations across genres, eras, and worldviews. My real contention isn't that analysis or literacy are bad, but that any cross-cultural conversation about faith, art, or masculinity can only thrive where the other side isn't expected to simply parrot your convictions back at you. Online, misreading isn't just tolerated, it's the point. Memes thrive on double meanings, on wrong readings, on finding yourself in the cracks between the intended message and the chaos of reality. The joke isn't that Bateman is a role model, the joke is that we have no other stories left, so we turn the warnings into identity just to make the pain legible. It's not about being media illiterate, it's about making something new out of the cultural trash heap. So, here's my counter-thesis. Maybe literally me isn't a sign of illiteracy, but of hunger. A hunger for meaning, for identity, for a story you can actually live inside. When you say literally me, you're not just looking for a meme, you're looking for a mirror. These characters are a placeholder for something that's missing. Recognition, purpose, or a chance at redemption. A way to feel seen and to belong, even if it means finding your reflection in the glass of a screen. If the culture won't give it to you, you'll pilfer it out of the ruins. Not because you're dumb, but because you're desperate. Not because you missed the point, but because the point missed you. Of course, there's a risk here. Identifying with broken or violent men can be dangerous, especially if the irony is lost. Critics argue that memes like these glamorize the very pain and violence they're meant to satirize. But maybe that's why the meme persists. It's a way to talk about wounds that don't heal just by understanding the right message. Maybe, in the end, the real struggle isn't between reading and misreading, but over who gets to claim the story for themselves. Every generation draws these boundaries anew. Which characters are warnings? Which are heroes? Which stories belong to the culture, and which can be claimed by the outsider? But here's what media literacy advocates often miss. These literally me characters didn't emerge from nowhere. They're part of a cinematic lineage that stretches back through decades of American mythology. To truly understand what's happening with Patrick Bateman and Tyler Durden, we need to trace this DNA back to its source. Before Bateman hunted for meaning in the boardrooms of Manhattan, before the Joker danced down those Bronx steps, there was Ethan Edwards, standing in the doorway between wilderness and civilization in John Ford's 1956 masterpiece, The Searchers. He's not just another Hollywood cowboy, he's the archetypal masculine figure who contains both what we celebrate and what we fear about traditional manhood. Edwards is fascinating, precisely because he resists simple categorization. He's the hero who saves the day through violence and determination. Yet he's devoted to a savage and stark ideology of what it means to be human, a traumatized outsider who can never truly belong in the society he protects. Sound familiar? He's the original necessary monster, the man who does terrible things that civilization requires but cannot acknowledge. In many ways, Ethan Edwards was literally me before we had a name for it, a character both idealized and condemned, whose complexities speak to the contradictions of American masculinity itself. What's changed isn't our ability to read these characters correctly. It's the cultural context in which we encounter them. The frontier has vanished, but the hunger for identity remains. Let's explore what makes Ethan Edwards both the emblem of Hollywood masculinity and, in a strange way, the grandfather of every literally me that followed. The Searchers tells a deceptively simple story. Ethan Edwards, a Confederate veteran, returns to his brother's Texas homestead 3 years after the Civil War. Shortly after his arrival, Comanche raiders attack, killing most of his family and kidnapping his nieces. The older niece is found dead, but Debbie, the younger one, remains missing. What follows is a 5-year odyssey as Ethan and his adoptive nephew, Martin Polly, hunt for Debbie across the harsh frontier. But as their search stretches on, Martin realizes something disturbing. Ethan's quest might not be about rescuing Debbie at all, or it may have a totally different definition of rescue than he realizes. The film's power comes from this tension. What are Ethan's true intentions? And as his hatred grows more consuming with each passing season, what will he ultimately do when he finally finds the niece he spent years searching for? On the surface, Ethan Edwards embodies everything Hollywood told us a man should be. He's hyper-competent, tracking skills that exceed even the Army Scouts, deadly with a gun, and possessing a grim determination that borders on superhuman. When everyone else is ready to give up the search, Ethan pushes forward through blizzards and deserts. His self-sufficiency is absolute. While others need company and comfort, Ethan sleeps alone under the stars. Where other men waver or compromise, he remains ideologically committed to his principles, even when those principles are terrible. He has no boss, no master. He answers to no authority but his own internal code. Physically, he's the archetype. Tall, broad-shouldered, voice like gravel and whiskey. His gun isn't just a weapon, it's an extension of his will. He knows the land, the enemy, and himself with a clarity that makes other men seem like children playing at being adults. Even his tenderness exists, though hidden. We glimpse it in the way he gently kisses his brother's wife's forehead and looks longingly after her as she takes his coat, suggesting a long-buried love. He protects Martin despite his Cherokee blood, and his search for Debbie, however twisted it becomes, stems from a primal sense of family obligation. In short, he is masculine power incarnate, the ultimate alpha male that countless westerns will try to replicate for decades to come. But Ford's genius is that he doesn't allow us to worship Ethan uncritically. The film forces us to confront the darkness at the heart of this masculine ideal. Ethan isn't just a Confederate, he's a true believer. When Martin asks if he's ever considered that the war is over, Ethan's response is chilling. Nothing's ended. America itself is foreign to him, a place where he lives, but not a place he can call home. His loyalty is to a lost cause, a phantom nation that exists only in memory. Ethan clings to the Confederacy not out of ignorance, but out of conviction. The lost cause mythology, the idea that the South was heroic in defeat, noble in its suffering, shapes his every action. But Ford won't let us romanticize that loyalty. He shows us its violence, its bitterness, and its endless cycle of loss. Ethan's hatred for the Comanche transcends the rational. It's metaphysical, spiritual, a consuming fire that threatens to burn away whatever humanity remains in him. When he mutilates the corpse of a Comanche warrior by shooting out his eyes, he explains with cold satisfaction that this will prevent the man's spirit from enjoying the afterlife. This isn't strategy, it's cruelty elevated to ritual. Most disturbing is his willingness to kill Debbie once he discovers she's been assimilated into Comanche culture. In Ethan's worldview, she's been contaminated beyond redemption. She's become one of them, and therefore must die by his hand rather than continue living as something he considers an abomination. In these moments we see that Ethan Edwards isn't so different from the Comanche chief Scar. Both are driven by revenge for slaughtered family members. Both see the other as less than human. Both operate outside the constraints of civilization, governed by codes of honor and violence that make them effective warriors, but dangerous to the very communities they ostensibly protect. When they meet, they each even sarcastically compliment the other's knowledge of their native tongue. The film's iconic final image tells us everything. Ethan stands in the doorway as everyone else enters the house. The camera tracks inside, leaving him silhouetted against the wilderness. Then the door closes, separating him from the domestic space he fought to protect, but can never inhabit. This visual poetry isn't accidental. Ford is telling us that men like Ethan Edwards, the rugged individualist, the man of violence, the uncompromising ideologue, have no place in the civilization they helped create. They are necessary, but ultimately expendable, doomed to wander between the winds when their bloody work is done. Yet the film acknowledges a profound and uncomfortable truth through Mrs. Jorgensen's speech. Someday this country will be a fine good place to be. Maybe it needs our bones in the ground before that time can come. Civilization is built on violence, blood, and sacrifice. The comfortable homes where good people live their peaceful lives are purchased with death, both of enemies and of those who did the killing. The settler's paradise requires both the elimination of the native and the eventual obsolescence of the warrior. Even Debbie's rescue carries this subtext. When Ethan finally confronts her, something changes. Instead of killing her, he lifts her up and says, "Let's go home, Debbie." It's a moment of grace, yes, but it also reinforces the idea that she must be extracted from her savage life and returned to civilization, that her Comanche identity is something to be rescued from, rather than respected. She is pulled from the wreckage of her tribe's camp as if it were a sinking ship, doomed to slumber in the depths of history. Ethan Edwards represents something vital about American mythology: the simultaneous glorification and rejection of masculine violence. We need Ethan to clear the frontier, to make the land safe, but then we close the door on him, pretending our comfortable lives weren't built on the foundations he laid with blood and bone. This pattern of creating masculine icons who embody both what we desire and what we fear, who we simultaneously celebrate and condemn, didn't end with the searchers. It evolved. The cinematic DNA of Ethan Edwards flows directly into the veins of our modern, literally me characters. But something crucial changed between 1956 and today. For Ethan, there was still a frontier, a place where his particular skills and terrible virtues had purpose. For the modern inheritors of his legacy, that frontier has vanished, leaving them with all the rage and none of the purpose, all the capacity for violence and nowhere to direct it except inward or at innocent bystanders. So what happens when that violence is no longer needed? When there are no more frontiers, just the neon signs of a small American town. In First Blood, we encounter a man who has many of the same masculine qualities as Ethan Edwards, haunted by a lost war that society cannot celebrate, and struggling with the same fundamental question: what makes a man in a world that no longer needs traditional masculine virtues? 26 years after audiences watched the doors close on Ethan Edwards, a new kind of warrior emerged on American screens. In 1982's First Blood, we meet John Rambo, not striding confidently across Monument Valley, but shuffling down a lonely road in the Pacific Northwest, his dirty army jacket marking him as something America wanted to forget, a Vietnam veteran. The film begins with Rambo searching for an old war buddy, only to discover he died from cancer caused by Agent Orange exposure. Now the last survivor of his unit, Rambo wanders into the small town of Hope, where Sheriff Will Teasel immediately profiles him as undesirable and drives him to the town limits. When Rambo refuses to leave, Teasel arrests him. At the station, the deputy's rough treatment, particularly a forced shower and shaving attempt, triggers flashbacks to Rambo's torture in Vietnam. In a panic, he fights his way out and escapes into the mountains, where the manhunt begins. What follows is a one-man guerrilla war against local and state police. Drawing on his special forces training, Rambo uses the wilderness as an ally, setting traps, improvising weapons, and turning the hunters into the hunted. It's a violent inversion of the frontier myth. The savage wilderness has come home to America itself, embodied in a man the nation created but no longer wants. Though marketed as an action film, First Blood is really about trauma. When Colonel Troutman, Rambo's former commander, arrives to help capture him, he delivers the film's premise. You're dealing with an expert in guerrilla warfare, with a man who's the best with guns, with knives, with his bare hands. A man who's been trained to ignore pain, ignore weather, to live off the land, to eat things that would make a billy goat puke. In Vietnam, his job was to dispose of enemy personnel, to kill, period. Win by attrition. Well, Rambo was the best. But crucially, Troutman also acknowledges what America has done to this perfect weapon. You send him back home to America. But back home in peacetime, he wasn't allowed to fight anymore. Back there in the world, he never fit in. It's in the film's devastating climax that First Blood does something revolutionary. After Rambo has seized control of the town, Troutman confronts him in the abandoned police station. What follows is one of cinema's most raw portrayals of PTSD and veteran alienation. Rambo breaks down completely. Through tears and rage, he describes coming home to protesters calling him baby killer, being unable to hold a job, and watching his friends die. Not all of them died in Vietnam, but that's where they were killed. When he talks about a friend dying in his arms, his body reduced to chunks of meat, the macho action hero veneer shatters completely. Nothing is over, nothing. You don't just turn it off. It wasn't my war. You asked me. I didn't ask you. And I did what I had to do to win. But somebody wouldn't let us win. This moment makes male trauma legible in a way few films had attempted before. The invincible warrior, the alpha male, is revealed as profoundly wounded. Not just physically, but spiritually. His hypercompetence in violence is inseparable from his inability to function in peacetime society. Yet for all its groundbreaking exploration of trauma, First Blood ultimately contains the very pain it exposes. After his breakdown, Rambo surrenders. The film ends with him in handcuffs, being led away by Troutman. The system that created him, rejected him, and then hunted him finally recaptures him. There's no real resolution to his suffering. He's still a drifter, still unwelcome in places like Hope, still haunted by Vietnam. The rural town can return to its peaceful existence, having expelled the violent reminder of America's disastrous war. Rambo may have made his pain visible, but visibility alone changes nothing about his fundamental alienation. In this way, Rambo shares Ethan Edwards' fate, necessary for his violent skills, but ultimately incompatible with the society he protects. Both men are pushed to the margins once their usefulness has ended. The difference is that Ethan knew his time was passing. Rambo's tragedy is that he was told his sacrifice would have meaning, only to discover that America had no place for him when he returned. But the most profound recapture of Rambo happened outside the boundaries of the original film. In one of Hollywood's most remarkable acts of radical rereading, remixing, and representing the meaning of the original source material, not missing the point, but actively rewriting it, the sequels transformed this broken, traumatized veteran into exactly what the first film was critiquing: a superhuman killing machine. Rambo First Blood Part 2 sends him back to Vietnam to rescue POWs, turning his trauma into triumphant revenge fantasy. Rambo 3 puts him in Afghanistan fighting alongside the Mujahideen against Soviets. Gone is the vulnerable man weeping about his dead friends. In his place stands a muscle-bound action figure with an ammunition belt and an American flag backdrop. This metatextual recapture is perhaps more insidious than the in-film handcuffs. By commodifying Rambo, by stripping away his vulnerability and amplifying only his capacity for violence, popular culture performed the same act of erasure that the original film was critiquing. His pain became packaging for action figures. His trauma became a tagline for posters. Even President Reagan couldn't resist the sanitized version, famously saying after watching hostages being released, "Boy, I saw Rambo last night. Now I know what to do next time." The irony is staggering. The commander-in-chief identifying not with Rambo's critique of how America treats its veterans, but with his capacity for righteous violence. What happened to Rambo, both within First Blood and in the cultural conversation that followed, reveals something profound about American masculinity and its relationship to vulnerability. We create spaces where male trauma can momentarily become visible, but then we rush to contain it, to transform it back into something marketable, something comfortable, something that doesn't challenge our national myths. This pattern of using men for their capacity for violence, and then discarding them, isn't just a cinematic trope. It's woven into the very fabric of American identity. From Ethan Edwards to John Rambo, we see the same story playing out. Men called upon to create order, to defend or expand civilization through violence, only to become obsolete once that order is established. The defining event of the American mythos is the Revolution, a founding that was, at once, a rejection of old world hierarchies and a civilizing mission imposed on a so-called wilderness. This tension, never resolved, echoes through the men Hollywood has asked us to admire. The story of American masculinity, and its contradictions, begins long before Hollywood, before Rambo or Edwards, even before America itself. It begins in 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany, igniting what we now call the Protestant Reformation. At its core, this religious revolution was about who had the authority to interpret sacred texts. The Catholic Church insisted that only its priests and scholars could properly understand and explain Scripture. Luther and the reformers who followed him proposed something radical, that individual believers could and should read and interpret the Bible for themselves. This seemingly academic dispute about textual interpretation had revolutionary consequences. If individuals could interpret Scripture for themselves, what other authorities might they question? What other hierarchies might they challenge? The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and direct relationship with God planted the seeds of modern concepts like liberty, autonomy, and self-governance. It's worth noting the parallel to our earlier discussion of media literacy. The Catholic Church's position was essentially that without proper training and guidance, ordinary people would misinterpret sacred texts, with potentially dangerous consequences. They needed experts to ensure they got the correct reading. The reformers countered that interpretation should be democratized, that meaning couldn't be confined to a single authorized version. When today's guardians of media literacy insist there's one correct way to understand Patrick Bateman or Travis Bickle, they're engaging in a centuries-old debate about who controls meaning, and who gets excluded when they get it wrong. These ideas about interpretive freedom and resistance to authority didn't stay confined to religion. By the late 18th century, they had evolved into political philosophy that would fundamentally reshape the world. The American colonists, many of them descendants of religious dissenters, began applying Protestant principles of individual conscience to their relationship with the British Crown. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence represent the political culmination of the Reformation's emphasis on individual dignity and freedom from institutional tyranny. The American experiment was at its heart a rejection of old world hierarchies, of kings and nobles, of established churches and inherited privilege. The revolutionaries envisioned a society where men could determine their own fates, interpret their own truths, and govern themselves without masters. This vision produced a distinctive ideal of masculinity, the self-sufficient citizen farmer who could defend his own land, provide for his family, participate in self-governance, and answer to no one. The American man was defined by competence, independence, and a willingness to resist tyranny, even through violence when necessary. But here's where the American story takes its fateful turn. Having won their freedom from colonial rule, Americans turned westward and continued the colonial project they had ostensibly escaped. The doctrine of manifest destiny declared it was America's divine right and duty to expand across the continent, imposing its vision of civilization on both the landscape and its indigenous inhabitants. The same people who had rejected the authority of king and church now asserted their own absolute authority over the continent and its peoples. The settlers who pushed westward weren't just seeking land or resources, they were imposing meaning itself. Every cleared forest, every planted field, every church and schoolhouse erected was a declaration. This wilderness must be sanctified by the symbols of civilization and Christian religion. This expansion required three things: competence to survive harsh conditions, violence to overcome resistance, and ideology to justify both. The frontier settler needed to be self-sufficient like Ethan Edwards, capable of surviving where civilization's comforts were absent. He needed to be willing to fight like Rambo, to kill and risk death for a cause larger than himself. And he needed to believe, with religious certainty, that his actions were sanctioned by Providence. In this way, America's founders and pioneers recreated the very structures of authority they had fought to escape. The freedom they cherished for themselves came at the expense of others' freedoms. The right to self-determination they declared didn't extend to those who stood in their path. Their rejection of old world hierarchies simply created new hierarchies with themselves at the top. This fundamental contradiction between America's revolutionary ideals and its imperial realities couldn't be resolved intellectually. Instead, it became embedded in the nation's culture, especially in its myths about masculinity. Hollywood's rogue heroes are more than entertainment. They're unconscious confessions about this unresolved tension. Ethan Edwards isn't just a character. He's the personification of America's relationship with violence. We need his skills to establish our civilization, but once established, that civilization cannot acknowledge its violent foundations. So we close the door on Ethan, just as America tries to close the door on the brutal realities of its founding. Similarly, John Rambo represents America's inability to reckon with the Vietnam War. The original film forces us to confront what we did to our enemies, and even more so to our soldiers, trained them for violence, sent them to an unwinnable war, then rejected them upon return. But the sequels transformed that painful truth into triumphant fantasy, just as American culture transformed the messy, morally ambiguous conquest of a continent into the clean, divinely ordained story of manifest destiny. These characters reveal something profound. The American dream needs its monsters, but it cannot ever fully embrace them. The virtues that built the nation, self-sufficiency, resistance to authority, capacity for violence, become liabilities once the nation is built. The hero who defended the homestead becomes the disturbing reminder of what that defense actually entailed. And when it is embraced, it is simultaneously sanitized, made palatable and uncomplicated. But this creates a profound dilemma for modern American men. If society no longer needs or wants the violent competence of an Ethan Edwards or a John Rambo, what defines masculinity now? If the frontier is gone, if wars are fought remotely or delegated to a professional class, if physical strength matters less than technological skill, what makes a man a man? One answer, perhaps the most persistent one, is sexual conquest. This brings us to a character who couldn't be further from Ethan Edwards or John Rambo. Andy, the protagonist of The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Rather than a prison, Andy is held by an ordinary retail job. Rather than being shut out from civilization, access to intimacy is the threshold he struggles to cross. As we shift from the harsh wilderness of Monument Valley and the war-torn jungles of Vietnam to the fluorescent-lit aisles of an electronics store, we're entering a different kind of masculine story. Not one about the violent competence needed to create civilization, but about whether sexual encounters are necessary to be truly adult, to be truly a man in a civilization already established. Where did I put that plot summary? I can't say a thing. I'll open this one. So there's this guy who lived his whole life pretty isolated from normal society. He doesn't socialize much, has basically zero romantic experience, and frankly, he's more comfortable talking with non-humans and enjoying his solitary hobbies than he is around people. One day, the people around him decide he's missing out on what life has to offer. They want to set him up with a woman who'll help him break out of his shell. He encounters a woman who knows her way around relationships. Suddenly, his life starts changing rapidly. He's exposed to alcohol for the first time, leading to both joy and confusion. He has his wild body hair removed and gets new clothes. He spends multiple days and nights with this woman who helps him grow into the full image of a civilized man. The non-human companions that had surrounded him before go on to new adventures elsewhere. He learns how to properly interact with others, leaving behind his childlike and isolated ways. Finally, he can take part in a community that's fully open to him. Wait a second. I think there's something off about my copy of The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Shabara! That wool-brained tablet hoarder Ian Nasser sold me a bootleg copy again. This isn't a Judd Apatow movie. This is ancient Mesopotamian literature. But seriously, the parallels are striking. From our earliest stories, humans have linked male adulthood to sexual initiation. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written over 4,000 years ago, the wild man Enkidu is literally civilized through a sexual encounter with the temple prostitute Shamhat that lasts an entire week. After this event, the animals no longer recognize him. He's become human. This pattern repeats across cultures. In ancient Greece, a man wasn't considered fully adult until he married and produced heirs. Spartan bachelors were publicly mocked at festivals for neglecting their duty to the state. Medieval European fairy tales almost universally end with the hero winning both a dragon fight and a bride. Even the Confucian coming-of-age ceremony for young men at age 20 was immediately followed by the expectation of marriage. The message is consistent across thousands of years and countless cultures. A boy becomes a man through sexual initiation, marriage, and fatherhood. These aren't just personal milestones. They're society's way of saying, congratulations, you're officially an adult now. This connection between masculinity and sexuality appears in our foundational religious texts too. In Genesis, we find two competing visions of manhood that eerily parallel what we've been discussing throughout this video. First, there's Adam, who is explicitly described as incomplete until Eve joins him. Unlike the animals or plants, Eve is formed from Adam's own rib, suggesting that full humanity already exists within him, but cannot be expressed until he forms a community. God literally says, "It is not good for man to be alone." Adam's identity is defined by communion, by relationship, by the ability to be fruitful and multiply. Then there's Cain, who takes a radically different path. After murdering his brother out of jealousy, Cain is marked and cast out, but he goes on to found the first city. His legacy is built on violence, dominance, and subjugation of others. This is essentially the same divide we've been exploring: masculinity defined through relationship and generational continuity versus masculinity defined through violence and conquest. The wolf pack as family versus the alpha wolf dominating through force. What's particularly fascinating is how these ancient templates still shape our modern stories, including comedies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin. On its surface, The 40-Year-Old Virgin is a raunchy comedy about a middle-aged man trying to lose his virginity. But look closer, and you'll see it's actually engaging with these ancient archetypes in surprisingly complex ways. Andy Stitzer is a modern-day Enkidu, isolated from full participation in society because he hasn't completed the sexual initiation that would make him, in society's eyes, a real man. His collection of action figures, his childlike hobbies, his apartment decorated like a teenager's room, these all visually reinforce his arrested development. When his co-workers discover he's a virgin, they react with shock bordering on horror, as if he's violated some fundamental natural law. They immediately appoint themselves his guides into manhood, just as Shamhat guides Enkidu. The waxing scene, where Andy has his chest hair painfully removed, even mirrors traditional initiation rites that often involve enduring physical pain. This theme finds its apogee with the final scene of the film, a musical number evocative of ancient fertility rites and festivals celebrating the arrival of summer. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite Andy being gentle and nonviolent, those around him repeatedly perceive a latent capacity for violence within him. His co-worker Caldwell assumes he's a serial killer with a freezer full of heads. Even Trish, his love interest, who in the final confrontation between them fears he might be a murderer when she discovers the illicit magazines David left alongside models of the female reproductive system. The film's climax puts this to the test in a way that directly echoes traditional trials of manhood. To reach Trish and finally lose his virginity, Andy must demonstrate physical prowess by racing his bike through traffic, endure serious physical injury when he crashes into a billboard truck, and then stoically rise from this painful ordeal to complete his quest. What makes the film so effective is how it simultaneously reinforces and subverts these ancient patterns. Andy does eventually complete his sexual initiation, but the film suggests his true maturation comes through emotional vulnerability and relationship, not just physical consummation. His victory rests in the fact that his sexual encounter flows from a genuine expression of love, rather than an empty need for sexual conquest. You see this not only in the narrative arc, but also in how the film lingers on Andy's anxieties, awkwardness, and most importantly, his honesty with Trish. Their relationship grows not because Andy learns to perform masculinity, but because he learns to open up, admit his fears, and be genuinely seen by another person. The story's emotional climax isn't the bedroom, it's Andy's confession of the truth and his willingness to risk rejection by showing his authentic self. This idea isn't just cinematic wishful thinking. It reflects a real shift in how we think about adulthood and relationships today. In contemporary culture, we're increasingly recognizing that maturity isn't simply about ticking off rites of passage like marriage or sexual experience. Instead, psychological research and everyday experience alike point to emotional intelligence, self-disclosure, empathy, vulnerability, the ability to sustain real intimacy as the deeper markers of growth. We see this shift reflected in countless real lives. People who have done everything right externally, got the job, got married, lost their virginity, can still feel unfulfilled and isolated, if they've never learned to share themselves emotionally. Conversely, those who struggle to meet society's milestones may flourish in adulthood when they form meaningful, supportive relationships, romantic or otherwise, based on trust and openness. Even in therapy, support groups, and online communities, there's a growing recognition that being able to talk honestly about one's struggles, admitting anxiety, loneliness, or insecurity, is a bigger sign of maturity than simply conquering life's challenges. In other words, the movie's ultimate message, that true adulthood is about connection and vulnerability, not conquest, isn't just a narrative twist, but a genuine reflection of what helps people grow in the real world. There are many ways people react to this movie, such as this 2019 article from the Michigan Daily by Ross Orjivsky, titled "Sex on the Silver Screen, the 40-Year-Old Virgin and the Reflection of Culture in Sex." Orjivsky argues that the film, quote, reinforces the belief that sex is sacred and one should keep themselves chaste until marriage, and perpetuates a, quote, double standard. Men who don't have sex are unmasculine, and women who do have sex are unchaste harlots. He's particularly troubled by Jay's advice to Andy to target drunk women at a club, which Orjivsky interprets as, quote, telling Andy to lose his virginity by way of despoiling young women. What's interesting here is that Orjivsky's reading exemplifies exactly what many media literacy advocates would call media illiteracy in other contexts. A tendency to examine superficial elements without distinguishing between what characters say and what the film itself is saying. When Jay advises Andy to target drunk women, the film isn't endorsing this behavior, it's satirizing it. Andy's attempt to follow this advice leads to disaster, vomit, and humiliation. The narrative punishes this approach rather than rewarding it. Orjivsky concludes that, quote, it's okay to laugh at this film, as long as you're laughing at and not with the jokes. But this presumes there's only one correct way to interpret the film's comedy, a position that ironically mirrors the very dogmatism that media literacy is supposed to help us overcome. To be clear, I'm not saying Orjivsky's reading is invalid. The presence of problematic subjects in film can inadvertently valorize them, even when the overarching message of a film is critical towards those subjects. But this is the exact same thing that Literally Me and other subversive readings of film entail, that the objects of cinema can be decomposed into a database of cool things that are then freely picked up and repurposed. This is just one of the multiple ways that one can engage with a film, especially one with many layers of irony, satire, and subversion. Any single lens will inevitably flatten that complexity. Now, if the 40-Year-Old Virgin asks what happens when someone lags behind society's script for manhood, American Psycho asks what happens when you play the part too well. Andy Stitzer's story ends with community, connection, and self-acceptance. Patrick Bateman's is a descent into isolation and violence, his identity hollowed out by the endless pursuit of status and dominance. In moving from Andy to Bateman, we're not just flipping a switch, we're tracing the full spectrum of modern masculinity, from anxious outsider to hyper-performer. Maybe the real danger isn't simply failing to be a man, but losing yourself beneath all the roles you're expected to play. Or has he? The question of what American Psycho is really saying, and how online culture has transformed its meaning through the Literally Me phenomenon, might offer some insight, but it will never close the door on discussion completely. Still, let's put on the mask, enter that dingy boardroom, and see what we can bring to the table. At least until Paul Allen shows off his analysis. In our journey through cinematic masculinity, we've moved from the frontier warrior to the traumatized veteran to the awkward virgin. Now we arrive at perhaps the most disturbing figure in our gallery, Patrick Bateman, the protagonist of American Psycho. To understand why Bateman resonates so powerfully with online culture, we need to examine what philosopher Alexandre Kojève calls animalization, a concept later developed by Japanese cultural critic Hiroki Azuma. Kojève makes a crucial distinction between animal needs and human desires. Animals have needs, straightforward cravings that disappear once satisfied. You're hungry, you eat, hunger vanishes. Simple. But humans have desires, complex cravings that aren't extinguished when their object is obtained. Sexual desire is the perfect example. Unlike simple physical release, human sexuality involves wanting to be wanted, desiring the desire of another. This intersubjective quality is what makes us human rather than merely animal. Patrick Bateman exists in a world where this distinctly human quality has been warped and hollowed out. In 1980s Manhattan, obsessed with consuming and competing, genuine connection seems impossible. Bateman doesn't seek mutual recognition between people. Instead, a desperate, twisted echo of Kojève's desire for desire manifests as an insatiable need for status markers. He craves the envy of others, demanding their desire be directed solely at his possessions and access. The perfect business card, reservations at Dorsia, the right suit, the right workout routine. This pathological redirection short-circuits genuine human intersubjectivity. His interactions, therefore, become chillingly transactional performances aimed at eliciting this object-focused validation. When he looks at women, he doesn't see individuals to potentially connect with, but rather a hierarchy of desirability based on surface attributes, reducing them to products to be consumed or assessed. When he looks at homeless people, he doesn't register shared humanity or suffering to alleviate, but rather jarring imperfections in his curated world, annoyances to be eliminated. The glimmer of human desire for recognition is there, but it's been poisoned and redirected entirely onto the transactional plane of consumerist one-upmanship. The final collapse into animalization comes in the film's most infamous sequence. Bateman, completely naked except for sneakers and splattered with blood, pursuing a prostitute through the halls of an apartment building with a chainsaw. It's perhaps the only moment we see genuine joy on his face. The mask of civilization completely dropped, reduced to pure predator and prey. But who is the real Bateman? The respectable investment banker or the psychotic killer? In truth, Patrick Bateman doesn't exist. He's a collection of brands, quotes, and social performances. The American Psycho is the Mr. Hyde who emerges when the potion of consumerist conformity and antipsychotics wears off. The film's devastating conclusion reveals that even when Bateman's mental instability bubbles to the surface, when he confesses his crimes, it's brushed off and ignored. His crimes disappear either into a haze of delusion or into the endless machinery of a society obsessed with upholding appearances. In the end, it doesn't matter which is true. Society doesn't need to catch him, because he is already trapped, consumed by the consumerist culture he embodies. As the final text tells us, this is not an exit. He's locked in a prison of his own making with no escape. To understand why Bateman became a Literally Me icon, we need to make a slight detour to Japan and its otaku culture. In his book, Otaku, Japan's Database Animals, Hiroki Azuma makes a fascinating observation about Japanese pop culture obsessions. The obsession with Japan in otaku culture did not develop from Japanese tradition, but rather emerged after this tradition had disappeared. To put it another way, the trauma of defeat, that is, the harsh reality that we had decisively lost any traditional identity, lies beneath the existence of otaku culture. What Azuma recognized was that otaku culture, with its obsessive cataloging of characters, tropes, and aesthetics, emerged from a profound national identity crisis following Japan's defeat in World War II and subsequent American occupation. This mirrors the crisis of American masculinity we've been tracing. Just as Japan struggled with contradictions emerging from defeat and economic transformation, American men have faced contradictions inherent in the nation's founding mythologies. The Ethan Edwards frontier masculinity became untenable in modern society. The Rambo-style warrior was glorified, but actual veterans were marginalized. Andy Stitzer's sexual coming of age revealed the hollowness of defining manhood through conquest. And in this vacuum, in this confusion about what it means to be a man in America, new identities had to be manufactured, often from contradictory cultural materials. Azuma describes how Japanese otaku culture exists in a strange double position. The Japanese themes and modes of expression created by otaku are in fact all imitations and distortions of US-made material. On the other hand, the presence of this culture is connected to the narcissism of the 1980s, and is also a fetish that can feed the illusion of Japan being at the cutting edge of the world. This perfectly describes the literally me and sigma male phenomena. These masculine identities are manufactured from fragments of mainstream cultural products. Movies like American Psycho, Fight Club, Drive, but remixed and distorted into something new. The irony is thick and layered. The very characters created as critiques of toxic masculinity become refashioned into aspirational figures. But this isn't simple misunderstanding. It's a creative response to contradiction. Just as otaku culture is both vilified and glorified in Japan, these new internet-manufactured masculinities provoke extreme reactions. To media literacy experts, identifying with Patrick Bateman represents a disturbing failure to understand the film's message. To the men creating and sharing these memes, it represents an acknowledgement of social contradiction that mainstream culture refuses to address. As Azuma puts it, for those who regard these contradictions as unacceptable, otaku are detestable. Conversely, those who overly identify with them end up becoming otaku. The Sigma male isn't supposed to exist in American mythology. He's not the team-playing alpha, nor the familial provider, nor the rugged individualist. He's a database-generated identity cobbled together from cultural fragments, a response to a society that offers no coherent vision of masculinity. But here's where things get truly interesting. What if these supposed misreadings aren't misreadings at all? What if they capture something essential that more orthodox interpretations missed? For years after publishing American Psycho, author Bret Easton Ellis deflected questions about Patrick Bateman. He claimed the character was based on his father, or on Wall Street types he'd observed. But in a remarkable series of interviews, starting in 2010, Ellis finally admitted the truth. In an interview with Robert Coleman, Ellis confessed, "Patrick Bateman was about me. No, I lied about that. I BS'd at the time because I didn't want to finally own up to the responsibility of being Patrick Bateman. So I laid it on my father. I laid it on Wall Street." 2 years later, he elaborated to James Brown of Sabotage Times, "Patrick Bateman was me. I was Patrick Bateman. I was living that lifestyle. My father wasn't in New York, the same age as Patrick Bateman, living in the same building, going to the same places that Patrick Bateman was going to. I was doing all that stuff." Ellis explained that the book emerged from his own unhappiness with the lifestyle he was living. "The impetus to write that book came out of my lifestyle and how unhappy it made me, and how the idea of becoming an adult seemed frustrating, absurd, and I was kind of enraged." Most surprisingly, Ellis admits, "I kind of like Patrick Bateman. I have to like the narrators in order to write them." This revelation turns conventional media literacy on its head. The character most often held up as an example of obviously not someone to identify with was explicitly created by an author identifying with him. The literally me phenomenon isn't missing the point of American Psycho. It may be understanding the point better than the critics who insist on a singular correct reading. When young men online say, "Patrick Bateman is literally me," they're not necessarily glorifying violence or misogyny. They're recognizing the hollowness of consumer identity, the performance of masculinity, the rage beneath the surface of conformity, exactly what Ellis was exploring in himself. The irony, the layering of meaning, the simultaneous embrace and critique, these aren't failures of media literacy. They're sophisticated negotiations with a culture that offers contradictory visions of what it means to be a man. The Literally Me meme began as a joke about awkward guys who over-identified with dark characters, but it evolved into something more complex. A self-conscious exploration of identity in a world where traditional masculine scripts have broken down. Far from being media illiterate, these online communities are creating new ways of reading culture, ways that acknowledge contradiction, embrace irony, and find meaning in the spaces between author intent and audience reception. When young men post memes saying "literally me," they aren't necessarily signaling admiration. They're warning you. Like poisonous frogs in neon colors, these memes may function as aposematic signals. A way to say, "I'm wounded, I'm angry, I'm not okay, and I will not be made into something consumable." They resist the kind of cultural recapture we saw with John Rambo. Bateman may be trapped, but he will never be digestible. His figure, refracted through online irony, serves as that aposematic warning. It signals a profound discomfort with the smooth surfaces of consumerist identity. But if this dark, ironic armor, forged from trauma and cultural fragments, becomes too heavy to bear, or too dangerous to wield, the question remains stark. What lies beyond the mask? What constitutes a genuine self when the scripts have failed? Some seek refuge in simpler narratives, stories that flip the very tropes that birthed the Literally Me phenomenon. The 40-year-old virgin, for instance, turns the alpha male myth on its head. Instead of domination and detachment, it offers kindness, vulnerability, and emotional maturity as the path to manhood. But such narratives risk dissolving into visions of uncomplicated harmony, where old antagonisms melt away, and every wound is healed through love, laughter, and a well-timed Steve Carell monologue. They offer wish-fulfillment escapes, not confrontations with the emptiness that Bateman reveals. Do these redemptive stories truly answer the void? Or do they merely paper over it with a softer, more socially acceptable mask? What happens to those who don't find community through sexual initiation? When positivity becomes mandatory, does it heal? Or does it simply erase the wounds we're no longer allowed to name? To understand what lies beneath these masks, and why young men online might adopt them, we need to turn to a surprising source. C.S. Lewis's final novel, Till We Have Faces, based on the Greek story of Cupid and Psyche. You might know the classical myth. Psyche is a mortal woman so beautiful that Venus becomes jealous. The goddess sends her son Cupid to make Psyche fall in love with a monster, but Cupid himself falls for her instead. He visits Psyche nightly, but forbids her from seeing his face. When her jealous sisters convince her to look upon him while he sleeps, he abandons her, and she must undergo trials to win him back. But Lewis retells this story from a radical perspective, that of Psyche's older sister, Orual. In the kingdom of Glome, where Orual lives, the primary deity is Ungit, a dark, primitive version of Aphrodite. But unlike the beautiful goddess of Greek myth, Ungit is represented by a formless, blood-smeared stone. Her temple is a place of dread, dark, stifling, thick with the smell of blood and death. From childhood, Orual learns to fear Ungit. The goddess demands blood sacrifice. Her priest wears the mask of a bird with a cruel beak, speaking in riddles while conducting bloody rituals. When famine and plague strike the kingdom, the priest declares that Ungit demands the sacrifice of the kingdom's most beautiful maiden, Psyche, to her son, the shadow brute who lives on the mountain. The sacrifice of her beloved sister shatters Orual's world. When she later discovers Psyche alive on the mountain, claiming to be wed to a god she cannot see, Orual cannot accept it. To her rational mind, shaped by her Greek tutor's philosophy, this can only be delusion, or worse, some monster taking advantage of her sister under cover of darkness. Orwell cannot see the palace where Psyche lives with her divine husband. To her, Psyche appears to be living in squalor, talking to the air, deluded about an invisible palace. Fearing for her sister's sanity, Orwell forces Psyche to light a lamp to see her husband's face, an act that shatters Psyche's world and leads to her exile. After a long reign as Queen of Gloam, Orwell encounters a priest who tells her the story of a new goddess, which she recognizes as her and her sister's own story, now buried under layers of myth, legend, and symbolic interpretation. When she tries to find out the end of the story from the priest, he replies, "But stranger, the sacred story is about the sacred things, the things we do in the temple." Fed up with the riddles and misinterpretations, she sets out to write her own account. The novel is Orwell's attempt to justify herself and condemn the gods who played these cruel games with her and her sister. But by the end of the novel, Orwell's complaint transforms into deep introspection and finally confession. This brings us back to Patrick Bateman and the young men who claim him as literally me. Like Orwell, Bateman lives in a world he cannot truly see, where meaning and authentic connection are invisible to him. Like Orwell, he constructs elaborate justifications for his monstrosity. And like Orwell, he confesses his sins, but his confession falls on deaf ears. Bateman's admission of his crimes is laughed off as impossible by his lawyer, and his erratic behavior is ignored by his peers. The parallels go deeper. Modern incel culture, characterized by resentment toward women and society, mirrors Orwell's bitter complaint. Both represent a wounded cry that nobody hears the truth of their suffering. Both mask deeper fears about inadequacy and invisibility, and both, crucially, fail to see how their demands for love become possessive, destructive claims of ownership. Where American Psycho, Until We Have Faces, diverge, reveals something essential. Bateman's confession becomes black comedy for the audience to relish in. We laugh uncomfortably at his extremity while reassuring ourselves we're not like that. But Orwell's complaint against the gods becomes something transformative, a journey toward painful self-recognition. Listen to how Orwell addresses the gods. "I know what you'll say, that I was shown a real god and ought to know it. Hypocrites. I do know. As if that would heal my wounds. Why did you lie to me? You said a brute would devour her. Well, why didn't it? I'd have wept for her, and buried what was left and built her a tomb. But to steal her love from me? The girl was mine. What right had you to steal her away into your dreadful heights? You'll say I was jealous. Jealous of Psyche? Not while she was mine. We want to be our own. I was my own, and Psyche was mine, and no one else had any right to her." What Orwell eventually realizes, and what makes Lewis's novels so devastating, is that her love for Psyche was never love at all. It was possession, consumption. She didn't love her sisters or her subjects. She consumed them, just as Bateman consumes everything in his path. The gods finally answer Orwell's complaint by showing her the truth. You are Ungit. Ungit, the terrible goddess who demanded blood sacrifice, the monster she feared all her life, was herself all along. Her possessive love was the true devouring beast. Till We Have Faces grapples directly with the darkness within the human heart, and how we hide that darkness through justifications and self-serving mythologies. As long as we retain those illusions about ourselves, we'll never be real people capable of genuine connection. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till the word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? How can they meet us face to face till we have faces? Even in our rejection of Patrick Bateman, we risk becoming him, constructing comfortable masks for ourselves that have the right opinions, respect women, and promote general social concern and less materialism. even while enjoying a $7 million Hollywood movie replete with the very obscenities and toxic ideologies we claim to reject. It is not good to be Patrick Bateman, but it is a lie to say we aren't all capable of his emptiness, his desperate performance, his hunger for validation. The young men posting literally me memes aren't failing to understand these films. They're recognizing themselves in them, perhaps more honestly than the rest of us allow ourselves to do. Until we can fully admit to what we are, the Orwell beneath our complaints, the Bateman beneath our consumption, we have no hope of becoming anything better. Until we can bear the sight of our real selves, we'll stay trapped in this maze of masks and mirrors, doomed to blindly wander between the winds of this world's ever-shifting praise. We do not need a better mask. We need the courage to confront what lies behind it.
My soul.